We have Angela and Henia joining us for tonight, who's going to talk about climate justice and feminism. So maybe we can, since there are 8 right now online, maybe we can start with some rounds of introduction. Let's start with Angela and then Henia, maybe.
I'm Angela Bartolome. I'm based in LA. I am a clinical social worker for my paid work, but in my work with a firm, I've been organizing for the past 11 years. The daughters and two organizers that met in the Philippine movement and continued activism here in the States. In a firm, we're a transnational feminist organization where we have 9 chapters nationally. And we, from LA to New York and Boston, we address issues of the various struggles inflicted and oppressed to the communities of women and women of color. There we go.
Okay, my name is Henia, or Enya. I'm French-Algerian. I was born and raised in Paris, and I've been living in the States for about 23 years on and off. My work is mostly with youth. My day job is working at a school, at a bilingual Latino school. I also work with at-risk teens, age 14 to 18. I work primarily with youth of color because they are the future, because I hope to be bringing them a voice and opportunities that I didn't have as a young Arab girl growing up in Paris. And I also do work with undocumented migrants. I'm based out of Salt Lake City, so most of the work that we've done is to support families of folks who've gone through the deportation process. We also work to stop tar sands mine in Utah, so some land defense work, and I also work in solidarity with different indigenous communities all around the Southwest. So I identify as a community and a land defender and as an educator.
Thanks, Enya. Then we can go maybe from the top of the list going down. So Mahandra, can you start introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Mahandra Rodriguez. I'm currently Young Feminist Fellow for Climate Justice with WeDo, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and part of the Young Feminists for Climate Justice Network. And I'm really excited about this call. This call is being recorded, and hopefully there won't be any technical issues throughout, but then we're hoping that the recording can also be shared with others who weren't able to make it at this time. Anyway, so I'm based in Peru, and I'm also a part of Tierra Activa Peru, which is a youth collective national network that works towards system change, not climate change.
Hi, everyone. I'm Juliana Velez, and I'm currently working for the Women's Environment and Development Organization. I help manage and coordinate a variety of climate justice initiatives. One of those being work with Mahandra on the Young Feminist Fellow for Climate Justice, as well as some other advocacy type programs. I'm really excited to be on this call, and you all have done a great job of planning it. So thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Let's go to Kate.
Kate doesn't have a microphone, but Barbara and her have introduced themselves on the chat.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Renee. I'm currently working with Climate Tracker. We write about climate change issues and the climate negotiations, and basically track what's happening in the UNFCCC. So that's me, and tonight I will be facilitating the discussion. So we will start with, this is how we're going to do it. We will start with a discussion on feminism, definition of feminism. So Angela and Henia will start the discussion with us, and then if there are questions, we can ask them after that. The second part will be a discussion on climate justice. And again, Angela and Henia will do the discussions, and then we can ask questions after. And then the third one is how does feminism and climate justice intertwine, and some practical or real life examples of how the two concepts work together. So that's how we're going to do it. And if there are any maybe reactions, we can use the chat box below. Yep. Okay, so let's start. Let's start with the definition of feminism. Angela and Henia?
This is Angela from our firm. So when we were looking at this, I was looking at what is feminism. And in the firm, we practice transnational feminism. And by that, I mean that we look at the intersectionality of oppressive factors on women identified, and with this like theoretical idea of what feminism is, of like justice for women in whatever context we're talking to, we have to practice, like we engage in practice. So we practice feminism, and what our feminism looks like is boots on the ground work. So not only are we fighting for against patriarchy and capitalism for the justice of women, we put that into action from our activities every day, and hopefully, a lot of us have paid work in nonprofits, and as a volunteer-based organization, we know that this is one of our factors. That's why we have to be feminist, because we don't work just one shift. We work our second and third shift to work towards justice for women.
Okay, thanks, Angela, for that. Henia, do you want to go next?
Sure. I have a really hard time with definitions because for me, they're always evolving. And I think part of the reason that I'm really excited for this conversation and the conversations that you all have been carrying and will continue beyond today is that I think one of the most important things we can do together is think and strategize, and part of the networking is how do people who are from all different parts of the world come together and share the things that work in their communities. And so when I think of feminism, I was really cautious of the term feminism for a really long time because of its relationship to whiteness and to heteronormativity. I think it was a lot of the times really centered around straight white women. I think a lot of women of color. I think a lot of queer and trans women of color, and queer and trans women in particular, just period, were really left behind. But I think that I really like what Angela's saying, really boots on the ground and the practice of intersectionality, because I think it's becoming more and more clear to folks that we really have to be founded in intersectional work. And so for me, feminism is how do we really, as women identified folks, as femmes, as women identified bodies, how do we take back power that's been taken away from us by these systems within which we exist, like patriarchy and capitalism? It's not the notion that we're trying to ask for that power back or that we need it from patriarchy. It's a notion of how do we recognize it in ourselves. I think that the woman body is a life-carrying force, and women in a lot of traditions and cultures are the carriers of life, but also of tradition, of culture, of language. And I think that gender-based violence and exclusion of women is a tool of colonization, right? It's the best way to annihilate a community. A lot of indigenous folks will say that to you, that one of the steps of colonization, one of the successes of colonization is how it's impacting our women. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of, for me, it's recognizing what the driving forces of communities and also what the emotional labor and the hidden labor that a lot of women and women identified folks carry and the work that we do that keeps things together, that keeps things moving forward, and how a lot of the times that's exploited and erased, and yet it's so critical to holding things together. So I think what's interesting to me is definitions of feminism that really include like I said in the beginning, women of color and how it centers the intersections of our identities, and also how it really includes queerness and gender nonconformity, because that's real for a lot of us, and I know that there's been a lot of work and a lot of thought and a lot of energy put into different notions of feminism beyond the binaries and beyond straightness, right? So that's not a very clean definition, but again, definitions are really hard for me. And a lot of the time I work in communities where academic definitions aren't really welcome or aren't really effective, and so it's evolving, but I like hearing the definitions. I really appreciate folks who can put concise words to it.
On the concept of intersectionality, so we are a diverse group in the Young Feminists for Climate Justice Network, and I know that we all don't have like the same definitions or the same backgrounds on feminism, so maybe we can explain some more what intersectionality is and how it plays a role, an important role in the feminist movement.
In the feminist movement within a firm, and how we practice intersectionality is we are women of color, we immigrants, migrant women, we look at race, class, gender, how oppressive factors including poverty, migration have impacted who we are, but we also look at, there are different privileges and different experiences that come now together into why we have to create change and challenge and dismantle patriarchy. And in the same breath, we also look at the parallels of what we see locally, whether that's, in New York or in Philippines or in Mexico, that the struggles of women are parallel. They have the same oppressive factors, but they look different based on what's on the ground. So when we talk about intersectionality, it's these, it's these facts, it's how capitalism or imperialism has played out in their neighborhoods and their communities, from the immigrant women putting themselves working in the fields, and right now there's currently 3 cases of women who've died across California from working in the fields from heat issues. And in that same, we look at why were they placed in that situation? Why were they not recognized when they needed help? Nobody addressed their needs. Why were they being underpaid and had to be at work even if conditions were unsafe? We look at all these issues to how we attack and dismantle systems. Did that answer, or just open up more questions?
Mm-hmm.
No, thanks, Angela, for that. I think that opens up a lot of course, other questions, but I think that's like your example of these workers dying because of heat is like one example of course, later how we can link, feminism and climate justice together. But okay, how about Henia?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's really interesting how intersectionality came out through Black feminism too, right? The fact that I think what Angela's pointing to is right on point. I would actually really like how you phrased that, because we can't just look at one thing. We do have to look at all the systems within which we exist are overlapping and they're intersecting. And of course, the oppression of women is going to look very similar, but also different in different places of the world, because we exist within the systems that are oppressing us, that are exploiting us, that are killing the earth, that are that are hurting our bodies are the same, because they're working on a global scale. But yet, obviously, it's going to look different in different cultures and in different bodies. And all of these systems are intersecting and overlapping all the time, and our own identities are made up of so many different components, and our own experiences and our layers of privilege and our layers of oppression. And I think what it translates to in the work for me on a day-to-day is understanding where in my life I need to stand in my power and or sit in my power and take that power back, and then where I have, where I am an oppressed body, but also the places where I have privilege and what that looks like on the daily, like I think we have a responsibility to privilege as a daily act, as a daily practice. And so I think it's going to look different in different women's bodies. And I think us understanding that in each other and understanding that we can't all move through the world in the same way, and seeing in each other where we have privilege and where we don't, and how we stand, I'm trying to get rid of the word stand, and how we really support one another and see each other is really really important. And I think also the thing to add to that for me is understanding intersectionality also forces us to slow down. There was a really brilliant organizer that I know who's doing civil rights work out in North Carolina, and she says there's a slow time and the fast time. There's the fast time, the pace at which we're being hit by the crises, and the pace at which things are deteriorating, and also capitalism, right? It's fast, it's making money, it's time is money, etc. And then there's a slow time, and that's the time that we carry in our bodies. That's the time of our ancestors. That's the time where we get to do things like this and get to know each other and build and have important conversations and sip on that cup of tea, and that's where a lot of our organizing and the work that we do should come from, that slow time, but often has to come from the crises and the quickness of things. And I think intersectionality forces people to just slow down and kind of take it apart, right? Like it's like this onion and we're peeling off the layers, and we have to slow down in order to do that and to really see each other. And I really appreciate, I think slowing down is really important. So I think that analysis helps us to do that too.
Okay, thanks, Henia. There's definitely something that we need to look into. I like what you said about the layers of oppression that we need to face every day. So, and obviously climate justice adds to that layer of oppression. So maybe we can, I don't think anyone has a question. No one's sent any message on the chat. So we can go to the next topic of discussion, which is climate justice. I know most of the people here in this call are already working on climate justice, so this is just like a quick discussion on what climate justice is, and then after which we can move on to discussing how feminism and climate justice, these two concepts, intertwine. So, Angela and Henia?
Climate justice. Well, for me, climate justice is moving beyond this kind of like, there was a mainstream green movement that really talked about the impacts of climate change and how we needed to make a greener version of what we had. And I think climate justice really digs at the fact that climate crises and climate change exacerbates and perpetuates already existing inequalities, whether those are social, racial, economic, and so many more than that, right? And so I think the idea of climate justice is, came out of the environmental justice movement, at least in the U.S., and the notion of communities of color and poor communities and indigenous communities really being at the front of the struggle, and so also being at the front of the solutions for the struggle, but had been in a lot of ways robbed of that by this more mainstream green and more privileged movement, right? So I think climate justice was really trying to take that back, first of all, and then also acknowledging that it's not just about CO2 emissions, it's not just about the ways that nature is being destroyed, but it's also how that's impacting folks living on the planet. And I would also like to add that I would really love to hear what climate justice, how it's defined in other countries, because I know there's people on the call from Brazil and Germany, and one of you, I think, said you were living in Paris, and I know my understanding of climate justice is very U.S. centered because that's where my organizing and my resistance work has been. But I'd really love to hear if folks have things to add to that, what it looks like for you in your communities, if you're comfortable with that.
Henia mentioned a lot that I completely support and agree. I guess as trans feminists, we look at the intersectionality. It's a big part of why we look at this, right? And then we're looking at who's being oppressed. So climate justice for us, we would really look at what does this look like on the ground? How is this like? How has the injustices affected the lives of the women and um, transnational women internationally? Again, I think Henia was on point when I have a very U.S. definition, so I don't have very much to add behind Henia's discussion or behind her point. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So maybe let's call on someone to um, to share their own definition. I'm not sure if someone wants to volunteer because no one is volunteering on the chat box, but maybe I can call on Mahandra first.
Yeah, sure. No, I also really agree with what Enya has said, and I think that in the Latin American context, it's very much linked to extractivism, and to sort of the exploitation of natural resources from forests and from beneath the ground in terms of minerals, mineral extraction, and oil, and also gas, because those are sort of the impacts that people are living most directly, in terms of their rights to have access and to a decent livelihood and to their territories. And so talking about climate justice in terms of sort of global CO2 emissions and oftentimes this more I don't know, like scientific language that we use to talk about climate change, I think is maybe less relevant in this context, and it's more about seeing, what are the concrete mechanisms in which fossil fuels are being extracted, for example, and how does that impact people, and then the fact that people aren't benefiting at all from the outcome of that. So it's sort of injustice, in that sense, in the sense of exploitation and extraction and a massive extractivism, that is displacing people. So talking about climate justice and grounding it in movements, and in people organizing for their environment in Latin America, it's a lot about those connections. And I think in sort of international platforms, it's much more about, we're talking about historical responsibilities, we're talking about differentiated impacts, we're talking about who's caused it, who's being impacted. And I think that it's important to also begin to link it to issues such as mining, which is a sort of a source as well of global warming. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense, but I think that's sort of, in terms of grounding it in context, I think that's important to mention.
Thanks, Maha. So maybe I could share a bit from the Philippines. In the Philippines, the concept of climate justice is very, very new. It's not talked about actually because I don't know, for us, like it's all about like climate change, it's all about disasters, right? It's all about typhoons in and out of the Philippines every year. So, and I don't think Filipinos have a very good idea on the science. Maybe similar to to what Maha said, like all these complicated scientific facts and data on what climate change is, on what carbon emissions do, on the UN negotiations is very, very new. It actually just got the attention of everyone just maybe last week and 2 weeks ago when the president said he will not sign the Paris Agreement because of the weird things he believes in. But but yeah, so for us, climate justice, it's about the disasters that hit us every year. And although the movement is still quite small and the movement is quite new, a lot of the environmental groups are trying to maybe get out there and educate more people and bring awareness and say, hey, this whole thing, it's not just happening to us out of the blue. There's the science behind it, and this is what we're doing. So, yep, that's for me. So now that we have defined feminism and climate justice, maybe we can start discussing about how feminism and climate justice intertwine with each other, and how do these two concepts work together in real life or in practical terms. Why do we need to have the gender lens when we tackle climate justice? So again, Angela and Henia.
So how does feminism and climate justice intertwine? Looking at how women brunt the burden of most of these oppressive factors, from the homeland to their families to our own health to the reproductive process, this is one struggle for us. Looking at how women, specifically also indigenous women, across the globe are disproportionately strained and suffering by the unpredictable changes in our environment, in the balance of our existence, in indigenous lands. We're looking at, we need to, as feminists, we need to be at the head of our own struggle. We need to combat and break down the oppressive systems that have existed in law for hundreds of years, so that we can really look at what our justice looks like. A practice that Affirm has been working on the past couple of years is, what does your justice look like? We've been asking women and our sisters locally and abroad, what does your justice look like? Because only we are the ones able to shape that. We're the only ones that can really define that and make that look like what our existence should be looking like and what our end goal should look like. So when we talk about how do feminism and climate justice intertwine, that is part very much of how individual people and groups and movements are shaping what their justice looks like.
Great, thanks, Angela. I think that's an important question we can also think over in the next, not just tonight, but in the next few days. How does our justice look like? That's a good question. Henia?
Yeah, I really like that question too, and I'd love to hear some of the answers that are coming out of different communities. I don't actually have much to add to what Angela's saying, because I think that's how I see it intersecting. I think the one thing I'll add is, I think once disasters hit, and I think once communities are in crisis mode, and also as systems fail and collapse, I think there's room for more violence, and I think women and women-identified bodies are always on the front line of that violence. I think gender-based violence is real, and so I think that's one of the other ways how climate disasters are impacting us particularly. And I think also in terms of resistance work, I think that patriarchy is everywhere and is in everything. And so I think that the ways that we organize ourselves and the ways that we do the work is really, really influenced by patriarchy. And so how do we build communities that are strong enough to hold that, to see that, to witness it, to call it out? And how do we hold ourselves as sisters accountable to our other sisters? And how do we, even more importantly, right, hold the men accountable to that? Because I think that, in the little things too, like work has to be done, and there's work that everyone wants to do, and then there's work that nobody wants to do, right? And it so often falls on sisters to do the work that nobody wants to do, whether it's those emails or catching up or going to have that tough conversation with somebody, and it's like there's this like weird gender roles around certain things, and I think that it's really, really easy to fall back into that. And so I think that that's how feminism and for me intersects with so many justice movements, right, and so many resistance movements, is the work that's being put in by sisters and femmes, and the extra labor that's put there, which is taking away from other work that we could be doing, right? Or the ways that it's like, oh, well, we know that we need childcare, and we know that we need food, and we know that we need transportation if we're working in communities, impoverished communities, and in our own communities, right? We need that. And so why is it always falling on the sisters to make sure that's happening? It's a collective responsibility. So I think that the ways that the systems are set up, we're obviously mirroring them, right? And we're doing them in every little thing. And so it falls on us to really see them and check them. Otherwise, we're just perpetuating the same, trying not to say a bad word, the same stuff locally and in our day-to-day.
All right. Thanks, Henia, for that. I think that's those are very valid points. The Young Feminist for Climate Justice Network was, I think, made in the same, like in a similar concept where young feminists inside the UNFCCC gathered to have a safe space. And I think that was one of the most important things that happened in COP21 and continues to happen. So I think it's a very valid point, even in organizing ourselves and in organizing other women, or even in climate justice work. How do we maybe help each other out or have this safe space for each other? So before I move on to maybe the next part, does anyone have any questions or any reactions or any comments so far? Barbara says she's loving it and she's learning a lot. Thank you. Okay. So maybe we can go to some practical things. We've discussed with Angela and Henia that the purpose of this webinar and the coming discussions, the coming webinars, is that we are going to have this toolkit or handbook about feminism and climate justice, which we want to give out to organizers or organizations who want to work on climate justice with a gender lens or a feminist lens. So maybe Angela and Henia can give us some good practices or good practices on how we can help organizations and organizers in connecting feminism and climate justice work together.
So knowing that a lot of this is not our primary paid work, that this is our second and third shift, we have to also value our time, value our energy, keeping women at the front of the struggle. Knowing that women are the ones that brunt the burden of all these changes, of the impact of oppressive factors, of patriarchy, we have to be the ones creating what our justice looks like. We have to be the ones defining it, not other people. So, with our own privileges, we have to make space for those who don't have that. So, for me, when we talk about real life practices or real life examples, when we, as a firm, sent a couple women to post Typhoon Haiyan in Philippines, we sent two women about a month or two after, a couple months after the typhoon, and bodies were still there. We were wondering what's going on. On mainstream media, international media, everything's great, everything's fine, they're getting all this relief. But when we talk to the women, we ask, what is it that you need to really reclaim that justice that was taken away from you from this man-made disaster? And so we looked at what is justice. We're not practicing charity. What would your justice look like? And they told us, we want to be able to sustain without the dependence of international funds. We wanted to be able to have to birth our children and not worry if we have which one we can save. From us, we asked with our privileges, we had to make space to let them say what they wanted and how we could do that. So we did partnering with the community members and the women and let them tell us how we could be effective allies for them, for the women in that area. So utilizing our privileges and our resources, our goal was to make space and make what they said, happen. Nobody wanted a handout. They wanted how to make what's happened unnaturally in their homes, in their communities, and back to a point of justice, that they deserve the lives that they want. So that's what I was thinking when we said practical real life examples. So we practice our feminism in the effects of this man-made disaster, Typhoon Haiyan.
Thanks, Angela. Henia?
I like that. I like that Angela I like that Angela's highlighting, like, we're not doing charity. I think there's something to be said about solidarity and not charity. I think in terms of practicing feminism and understanding, again, that we all are at different places of that and we all have different access to resources. We've actually really centered practically in our community on creating a fund, a solidarity fund, that we've based out of an organization that has access to, a 501c3 status, which most of us don't. We're a lot of just like grassroots collectives, so we can't get money, a lot of donations. I mean, we can get donations from people, but it's easier to get lots of money and grants and whatnot through C3s. And so we've actually created a solidarity fund, and the sole purpose of the solidarity fund is for money to be dished out when we need it, kind of in the moment. A lot of times when you need money, it's kind of emergency style, to be able to go wherever it needs to go. And again, not as charity, but really as solidarity. As far as the things that I've seen work that has really helped the sisters be centered and valued, I think the system tries to really make us feel crazy and make us feel like, it's 2016, why are y'all still talking about these things? As people of color, why are you talking about racism? As women, why are you still talking about feminism? And sometimes you just need some love and support from sisters. Sometimes you just need to hear the stories and sit and feel the power of a circle of women sitting together. And so we do a lot of healing. There's a lot of healing circles, and that's all of us bringing our own ceremony, our own spirituality, our own practices into it, which then turns into a lot of creativity, right, and expression in art forms. There's lots of artists that just sometimes need a little extra room to breathe and just a little extra space to be able to create, because I think that art is really important in what we do. It also allows us to share stories, and I think then brings us to this next level. And I think you mentioned something about this, but we need to create our own media. And part of the reason that marginalized people don't get to tell their stories is because we keep trying to use the media, we keep trying to use like other people's tools instead of creating our own. And there's something to be said about being able to create, like, to tell our own stories, to write our own articles, to make our own videos made by women for women, and so I think that when we start to share the stories, we start to see the threads, and like you're saying, how oppression looks so similar yet so different in all these different places, and then from those narratives, and it's like, how do we tell the stories? And then there's that grows. And then I think also one of the most important things that for me personally is sitting with my elders and hearing their stories and learning from them. I think that a lot of women in kitchens, right, over time have passed on stories. And then with that, I'm Algerian, so we do tea. Tea is like a huge tradition, and so how do we learn to organize in ways that I think my ancestors would have organized around that cup of tea, which again is that slow time. And then I think with anything, there's a lot of homework that has to be done to be good accomplices to each other, like beyond being an ally, just really being an accomplice. Like, I'm going to show up for you and I'm going to hold my ground with you no matter what happens. Especially as we talk about intersections, right? And some of us carrying more burden than others. And I think that comes with homework. Like, how do spaces where there's queer folks of color, how do the other folks in that group understand allyship and accomplishment to those folks? And then something that we're just sitting with right now is sharing skills, so what we're calling survival and resistance skills. So we're starting with a self-defense class We're also going to do how to change bike tires, how to change car tires. We have some sisters who are doing birth work who want to share some things. We have people who want to share if we had to run to the mountains, what plants can we eat in this area? And so I think that it's a lot of the skills that aren't necessarily valued uh, in society, or skills that, you know, again, have that gender specificity to it that we're really trying to break from. And I think it's been really cool and really empowering for a lot of the sisters, and also just like, yeah, there's a war on our bodies, and there's a war on our homes, and there's a, you know, the systems are at war on our communities, and so we need to think that way, and we need to be disciplined and trained in that way. And so those survival skills are really important, and it's really cool for them to come out of sisters initiatives too.
Thanks, Henia. Does anyone want to add anything? Okay, so I'll read out Kate's reaction. She says, I agree about creating our own media and sharing stories. I attended a very insightful meeting on climate justice and human rights in London last month, and some other constituencies were surprised when we started talking about our priorities and demands, and we had so much in common despite different contexts. I wasn't surprised because I have a strong sense of the ways in which different forms of oppression are linked, but it's more of an intuition. And Anna says, yes, it's important to create counter narratives and have safe spaces to share and listen. Wow, okay. Thanks, Kate and Anna, for sharing your insights and reactions. So I think we're about to end our webinar for today, but before that, I think we can ask Maha to update us on what's happening with the network and what happens after this.
Sure. Thanks, Ayeen. So the Young Feminists for Climate Justice Network is an autonomous, independent, mostly online space that we created at COP21 because it was the first time that we had Young Feminist Day at the Women and Gender constituency, which is the daily meeting of all organizations and activists involved in feminism, gender equality, and similar issues. And we organized the panel, we shared our experiences. As Ayeen said, it was a really powerful space. We met one more time during COP21 with I think we were about 12 women identified people, and it just, we didn't really have a plan coming to that space, but we sat down and it just became a really wonderful opportunity to just share, to just talk about our experiences as young women, as young feminists within climate justice organizing, both in terms of just multiple forms of oppression and discrimination that we faced as young people in ageist societies, as women in patriarchal societies, and as sort of environmental activists, climate justice activists in the world that doesn't necessarily see the importance and relevance of that. So it just, it ended up being a really powerful space. And there we talked about the importance of having teaching tools, or just having resources where we could share and spread more of these stories and more of these experiences and insights, and especially from those intersections of age and of gender identity and of sort of our climate activism. And so, sorry, I got distracted. Prachi's asking, can you make me a presenter? Anyway, so part of that was, one of the things we talked about was to develop a climate justice 101 guide from a young feminist perspective. And so what that means, what that looks like so far, we've had a couple of Skype calls over the past couple months, is a zine, sort of a very visual, graphic, creative document that can just talk a little bit basically about what we've shared briefly in this call. What is climate justice for us? What does that look like? What is feminism? What it is and what it isn't, and also interpretations that we have for that. And as young feminists for climate justice, what are our particular demands or asks, or or struggles, talking about, for example, sense of urgency, the fact that, you know, young and future generations are the ones that are going to be most affected by climate change. The world that we're living in now is not the world that we're going to be living in a couple of decades or even a couple of years. And so understanding what that means for us, talking about ageism again, the importance of having safe spaces, calling for more engagement and participation, the fact that young women's voices aren't being heard necessarily in terms of more global or international narratives and media, again, referring to what Enya was sharing in terms of the importance of having our own media and controlling our own stories and storytelling, the importance of education, and in general just intersectionality and how, we don't just identify as young women, but we identify as, a whole range of different identities, and how do we come from that into a climate justice space. And it began as part of the UN climate negotiations, but the idea is for it to go much beyond that, because we know that that's not a space that's necessarily open or accessible or understood or even relevant to most people, where most of us are extremely frustrated with that process. And so, we've essentially been coordinating through the Young Feminists for Climate Justice Facebook group, and trying to work on this Climate Justice 101 guide. We have come up with, we've also had a couple calls talking about exactly the same questions we've been talking about here. And the idea, we have a draft version of that, and the idea is to come to a one-page document that can summarize some of what, some of the questions, some of the things that have come up in the conversation, and to be able to share that with a wider audience, and for that also to be the basis for this Climate Justice 101 guide. So, long story short, if anyone on this call and people that are interested in joining, it's not just the Young Feminists for Climate Justice space. It's also important to acknowledge it's not just for women identified people. It's for anybody who identifies as a feminist. And as a young feminist, we also haven't defined young, so there's no age limit in that sense, just anyone who identifies in that way. So yeah, we are probably going to have a call next week to talk about next steps for the Climate Justice 101 guide for new people to join, and to talk about just some of the tasks coming up. We would like to have a first draft, hopefully within a month and a half. So that's, just, I guess, a brief summary of what is that network, where it came from, and some of what we're working on, and definitely an open invitation for those who want to join.
Okay, thanks Maha for that. So I guess it's time to end our webinar. Huli says this was a great way to start the day. Yay! Thanks. And Prachi says she agrees with everything. Kate says she loves the idea of a guide and a zine. So thanks everyone for coming in. For me it's 11 p.m. so tonight, but I know for the rest of you it's just like the start of day. So I hope everyone gets to have a good day ahead of them while I sleep in this side of the world. So thanks Angela and Henia for joining us tonight, and definitely this discussion helps us in creating our guide/zine, which we will do in the following weeks. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for inviting us.